You cannot begin to imagine the danger ahead.
Neither can Frodo, and neither can I. Even the greatest lords of the elves could not force open a passage through Mordor. I would rather trust hobbit friendship than ancient power.
Very well, then. The Fellowship of the Ring shall set forth to Mordor.
The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Originally released in December of 2002, primarily through Washington US developer Surreal Software and acting publisher Black Label Games, is an experience that, well, it's something. It truly is a video game. As you might expect of me being a child of the 90s, I grew up with, and absolutely adored, The Lord of the Rings. My father will happily tell you many a tale of how I would curl up at age 5 or 6 reading the novels, which was apparently my bona fide superpower because, looking back, I have no idea how I managed it. I suspect I just skipped all the songs and glossed over the long-winded descriptions until I could actually make sense of and appreciate it in my older age. And when those movies came around, oh boy, did I watch the ever-loving hell out of those. Those theatrical edition DVDs, those extended edition DVDs were worn out to the absolute max, along with the Two Towers and Return of the King PS2 games, the Third Age PS2 game, the Battle for Middle-earth PC game, Lord of the Rings Warhammer, Lord of the Rings Top Truck, whatever. My point is, I spent a lot of time with this franchise as a young transparent being, with my best friend of the time also sharing a similar interest, which only fueled that particular fire of Mordor even more. Yes! Sorry. And within that intense swirling vortex of Lord of the Rings merchandise that I was only more than willing to lap up enthusiastically, there was one particular oddball game that always stood out in my mind. And obviously it's this. It's The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, released on Xbox, PS2, PC, and the Game Boy Advance, believe it or not, from September to November of 2002. And if I don't sound entirely thrilled when naming this game, well, don't worry. We'll get into it.
Elves have tried to join with dwarves against Sauron, but the dwarves prefer to hide in their dark caves counting their treasures.
Now, see, if you, like myself, grew up with or shared a similar appreciation for The Lord of the Rings in a gaming format at that time, I'm betting that you at least played the hell out of Return of the King and probably some Battle for Middle-earth as well. Those were the two shining Gondorian beacons of gaming excitement that swept through the fanbase at the time. Or at least that's how I remember it anyway. A fair number of people that I knew skipped the Two Towers game because Return of the King came around pretty quick afterwards, and the RTS crowd jumped on Battle for Middle-earth with about as much enthusiasm as Star Wars fans did regarding Empire at War. That is to say, a lot. But that best friend of mine that I mentioned previously, well, he had a copy of Fellowship of the Ring, and we played a whole bunch of it too. And about 80% of the memory that I can summon regarding this game basically just consists of running around the Shire in absolute terror because Black Riders want to get real stabby with some Morgul blades. Now, that probably sounds faithful enough to the movies, right? I mean, surely this game is an extension of the smash hit near billion-dollar opening chapter to Peter Jackson's widely acclaimed monster trilogy adaptation of Tolkien's masterpiece? Well, yeah, no. No, it is not. Okay, here's the weird thing. Even though this game was released mere months prior to Peter Jackson's Two Towers movie, and released in the same quarterly period as EA's Two Towers game, Surreal Software's Fellowship of the Ring is actually an adaptation of the book. not the movie. It is not affiliated with the film in any fashion except in regards to the source material. And on the surface, that decision appears mighty strange.
Hey! A bullfrog!
Durin's bane!
Alright, so at first I couldn't understand this. Why in the holy goddamn hell would you not adapt Peter Jackson's movie? I mean, surely that concept is ripe with opportunity to make some easy cash grab moolah? And what's even funnier is that even in spite of the biblical amount of things that you can say about EA, they clearly understood this. Because EA's Two Towers game isn't just a Two Towers adaptation, it also covers the slopes of Mount Doom, Weathertop, Moria, and Amon Hen. How does this make any sense? Why were these two games released so close to each other if one was going to go trotting around in the novels and the other was essentially an adaptation of both the first and second movies all rolled into one? And to be honest, I couldn't get this shit out of my head, so I did a little bit of digging, went looking through some old press releases and interviews trying to find a concrete answer, got a little bit carried away, I will admit, but I ultimately discovered that this absolute mess of a release schedule was in fact due to your favourite interfering factor of adapting any property. You guessed it, this all happened because of an issue with who owned which licensing rights to do what within the context of getting these games off the ground. Basically, Sierra Online held the rights to adapting the Tolkien books into a video game format, but could not include anything from the New Line Cinema movies as they did not have the necessary rights to do so. Whereas on the other hand, EA didn't actually secure the licensing rights needed to adapt the movies into a video game format until sometime in 2001. So by this point, developing a dedicated Fellowship of the Ring game was pointless. They'd missed the boat. Instead, what they ended up doing was from around February 2000 onwards, spend a lot of time reviewing both the Fellowship of the Ring and Two Towers scripts, visit the Weta team to garner more of an understanding of how the movies will look from a design point of view, and once the rights were finally acquired, ultimately forged ahead by making a Two Towers game while still including signature moments from the first movie. It's also worth noting that, like Sierra and Surreal Entertainment in regards to the films, EA couldn't include anything from the books that wasn't specifically mentioned in the movies, as this would potentially trespass on the rights held by Sierra. This is probably a factor that contributed to the more action-oriented structure of the Two Towers and Return of the King games. It's better off to just keep things simple, focus on the action, and not get bogged down with the legal tomfoolery of what you're allowed to use and what you're theoretically not allowed to use. But Jesus fucking Christ, wow. I was not expecting to fall headfirst into such a stupid mess, but it does finally answer a question that little old ghosty had when he was a child. Why the hell does the Two Towers game have so much of the Fellowship of the Ring included? Well, this is apparently why. The more you know, I guess. So, now that my ramble of madness is concluded, what about that Fellowship of the Ring game, eh? Alright, so right off the bat, I will commend one particular thing about Surreal Software's Fellowship of the Ring adaptation. When Sierra Online actively went out of their way to emphasize that this would be a dedicated adaptation of the book, with certain storylines and characters being included that were perhaps cut out of the movie, and a huge amount of the dialogue literally being read word for word directly from the pages of the novel, they meant it. Be it either touching on simple plot points such as Frodo's dealings with Lobelia Baggins, or the fact that Farmer Maggot actually ends up helping Frodo instead of just chasing them off his land, or Tom Goddamn Bombadil, who admittedly I absolutely despise because he annoys the shit out of me. A lot of the Fellowship of the Ring's charm can be drawn from how earnestly Surreal Software attempted to make this thing a reasonably authentic recreation of Tolkien's work. And on the surface, it does appear to be a fairly successful one. Out of pure coincidence, I was already on a bit of a Lord of the Rings kick by the time I picked this up, and happened to already be listening to the Fellowship of the Ring audiobook when I started playing this game, so it was a genuine delight that so much of the game's dialogue replicated what I had only just recently listened to. allegedly there are roughly 5,000 lines of dialogue in this game that, according to a GameSpot article, are lines that were either recreations of existing dialogue or were taken verbatim from Tolkien's original novel. That's a fair statement of effort right there, and one I can absolutely appreciate. Take for instance one of my all-time favourite scenes from the Lord of the Rings novel, a brief moment where Aragorn and company spy instances of flashing lights and distant explosions that appear to be coming from Weathertop, which actually ended up being a battle between Gandalf and the Ring Wraiths, as was revealed at a later point of the book, but ultimately ended up being cut out of the movie. Well, that scene is in this game, and it was one of the small many nods to Tolkien's original work that can be really nice to see. You'll fight your way through the Barrow Downs, or be forced to deal with Old Man Willow and the treacherous Old Forest. And with every new inclusion from the novel that the film might have skipped over out of pure necessity, it establishes Surreal Software's adaptation as one that can be a curiously exciting experience to work your way through, as you start to wonder what else they might have included.
It appears to be a G and a 3.
G for Gandalf.
Now, this is probably a good point in the video to turn towards the meat and bones of an actual Fellowship of the Ring video game, the visuals and the gameplay itself. And both of these factors can be an extremely mixed bag.
The shore is clear. Let us retrieve our boat and continue on.
While visually there are plenty of nods to Tolkien's work and Bakshi's animated adaptation, with the Black Riders in particular being a rather notable example with piercing red eyes and adorning themselves with skulls, helmets and other such menacing trophies. Across the board, I'm now going to have to paraphrase Melon, who happened to comment on the game's visuals while I was streaming it in the call with him. At times, this game unfortunately looks barren as fuck. Okay, true, you will get moments that can honestly look rather nicely designed from a visuals point of view, such as the cutscenes, which honestly don't look that shabby at all. I really like the look of these. Or within Bag End and the Prancing Pony, or while exploring Moria or Lothlorien. A lot of these locations look okay, I like these. But while venturing across Middle-earth from one location to another, or even when starting to drift outward from the Shire itself, you'll be hard-pushed not to notice how outright bland this game looks at times. To briefly touch on the character models, I don't mind how these look for a 20-year-old game. They're faithful enough to the source material, and while hardly groundbreaking in terms of character design, I can't really complain when most of these look like they would fit right in with an early 2000s Harry Potter game. But the environmental design is honestly all over the place. Be it either Amon Hen or the Gates of Moria, the Barrow Downs, or when approaching Weathertop, a lot of this game's environmental design is extremely uninspired. Lots of green, grey, brown, mush, rocks, semi-dead trees, and more rocks. Not exactly the most engaging level design. And again, that's not to say it's always like this. I love the clear attempts made by the developers to make some of the book's more well-known locations stand out, but when the lackluster levels come around, they really drag a lot of the game's atmosphere down with it, which, by the way, can be surprisingly effective when all of the elements click into place. I'm sure this comes as no surprise to you, but I'm mostly referring to Moria here. The ominous doom and gloom of the Dwarven Tomb can at times be mwah, lovely chef's kiss right there. Outstanding. Or rather, I would feel like that if it weren't for the fact that the game's camera system is a literal psychopath. So, let's talk about the gameplay. Alright, a generous man would describe the Fellowship of the Ring's gameplay as straightforward. You take control of either Frodo, Gandalf or Aragorn, depending on which point in the story you happen to be playing. And with each of these 3 characters, you'll be offered slightly different approaches in gameplay. Frodo, as you might expect, is far more stealth orientated. He mostly gets through levels by distracting enemies with rocks or relying on allies to bear the brunt of enemy attacks. And you're also offered a short period of time in which the ring's invisibility can be used before Frodo ultimately succumbs to the darkness of Sauron. Not a bad setup, really. Whereas on the other hand, most of the game's combat via Aragorn and Gandalf is offered through fairly simple hack and slash engagements. Some projectile based attacks with Aragorn's bow or a set of magic spells if you're playing as Gandalf, and the odd boss battle. Again, doesn't sound all that bad. Except, now I have to describe it as an honest man. Which is to say that the gameplay, while not exactly terrible, is so goddamn half-baked that I'm terrified the pie's filling is gonna stick its legs through the pastry base and walk the fuck off with my dinner. Again, it's not terrible. I comfortably played through the game, but a huge reason as to why it was so comfortable is due to the fact that the gameplay didn't really elicit a single inspired emotion from me. There were no truly difficult sections or engaging battles. The hack and slash back and forth is dull and was only further hampered by the fact that the game's AI is outright terrible at times. And the complete lack of any form of a progression system basically means that it really doesn't matter how well or terribly you do. You're not getting anything out of it, so why should you even care? There are absolutely zero magic upgrades, no equipment upgrades, no health or mana upgrades, nothing. However, to dullify the gameplay even more, there's plenty of health items around. You have infinite ammo when it comes to arrows, Gandalf gets absolutely drowned in mana refills, so spells can be used in abundance, and to top it all off, if your companions can die, they never did while I was playing the game. So screw it, you might as well just let them tank the trolls and various other enemies coming your way. I'll sit back here and pelt them with arrows, I don't care. In fact, out of pure curiosity as to what might happen if a companion dies, I heartily shoved Gimli off a bridge. And the game rewarded me with nothing. It didn't acknowledge it in the slightest. He just reappears at a later point of the game, minus 2 broken legs. And to further touch on the game's AI, when I say it's terrible, I'm sorry, but I absolutely mean it. Enemies and companions will get stuck on pretty much anything if you let them. You can very easily exploit the Black Rider's AI by just constantly pelting rocks in any direction. Enemy aggro tends to be unreliable, and again, massively exploitable. Why should I bother aggroing this troll when I could just machine gun arrows into him from a safe distance? I'll stay here, thank you very much. There was also a bizarre moment where Gimli and a troll seemed to prefer heartfelt discussion as opposed to severing each other's limbs. They just met in the middle of this bridge and didn't do anything. I'm guessing I might have interrupted something when I finally lost patience and Servant of the Secret Lightning shocked his ass into oblivion. But oh well. However, with all of what I've just said being taken into consideration, I didn't hate the Fellowship of the Ring's combat. In fact, I'd probably feel a lot more forgiving towards it if it wasn't for one particular element that I've already mentioned. The camera system, which I genuinely wanted to crucify by the end of the game. This camera system, this motherfucking camera system, I hate it with every fiber of my being. It'll get stuck on things, block your view with background assets, phase through things. It'll have a literal heart attack if you do something so simple as walk through a door. Or it will decide to just snap your neck back to ground level, as opposed to the far more practical upper angle that allows you to see things more clearly. There, did you see that? I swear to you, I'm not doing that on purpose. Alright, let me rein things in for a second. Obviously, being a rather old game, you do expect to run into some certain chinks in the game's mithril armor, but there's one particular factor that I need to point out that may very well be the culprit of a few of these. The PC port. The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring PC port sucks. And when I say it sucks, I mean it sucks. Yes, this is a 20-year-old game that wasn't designed for modern operating systems and all that, but I've played a lot of old games on newer systems in my time, and I have never encountered a PC port so goddamn unreliable as this. From the game constantly crashing or randomly shutting down, to rampant texture fuck-ups and instances of in-game dialogue literally interrupting itself, the PC port of this game is terrible. I tried everything I could think of, from compatibility settings to fan patches, or even trying an alternative laptop, just in case my main desktop was the problem, and nothing worked reliably enough to keep this game running in a stable form. To completely interrupt this train of thought, my all-time favourite texture fuck-up is the fact that you can see Frodo's terrified eyes staring back at you when using the ring. So, if you want to play this game, you have two choices. There's a PC abandonware version that you can snag completely for free, and after fighting with it a little bit, you will be able to run it. Just expect some irritation along the way. Or you can do as I recommended with Jaws Unleashed, and play a PS2 or Xbox copy if you can get your hands on one that isn't stupidly expensive and happen to have the appropriate console. And you know what, I still would kind of recommend that you do. When I was a wee transparent one, I liked this game. I enjoyed the focus on Tolkien's work, I liked the atmosphere, I had fun with the game's simplicity even if the gameplay really isn't all that engaging, and to be honest, part of me still really enjoyed going through it 20 years later, warts and all. Oh, and I meant to mention this before, but the soundtrack is really nice. I've used a fair bit of it throughout the video, and I legitimately loved a lot of this soundtrack. And out of sweet, sweet irony, In the House of Tom Bombadil is probably my favourite. Okay, that's pretty much all I want to say on this one. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry if I've said something that might have upset your childhood. It certainly upset mine to see the flaws of this one. There have been a lot of suggestions for the 2022 roster, so I honestly can't wait to knuckle down on something new. There are a couple more well-known games to be reviewed this year that I'm honestly looking forward to getting my teeth into. So for now, that's it from me. And just before I go, I would like to wish a very special thank you to my new supporters over on Patreon. If you didn't see the video, I have one of those now. And in particular, thank you so much to Game Master, DarkRaptor86 and BFD Survivor for your pledges to the highest tier. Your support is incredibly generous. I don't deserve any of you and I love you all.